to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm here with David Anderson once again, and we are 24 days, depending on when you're listening to this, away from Rutgers football returning home opener on August 28th. We're talking Rutgers football here as we're now in the second week of training camp. We haven't got together in a little while now. Let's start it off with kind of what I think is the biggest news so far during training camp, the addition of YD Collier, who reclassified. Big time recruit, big time defensive end, major potential for Rutgers, reclassifying, joining the team this training camp. What are your thoughts there, David, initially to start off our talk here?
First off, I want to say a lot of this was covered pretty well by some of the other writers and podcasters. I know Bobby Darin and Brian Doan were on this pretty early, Chris Eisman as well. And then Richie O'Leary was talking about it in terms of, this is a guy whose just potential is so high that every person who sees him, he shoots higher and higher up their recruiting boards. And so trying to keep him committed was going to be a very, very tall task. And even if you did, the amount of resources you'd have to devote to keeping him committed at the expense of potentially other guys that you're either trying to keep committed or add or just, keep on your team, I think is the number one takeaway is that you got on this guy early and then keeping him in the fold. And then, of course, the second thing is, well, you want him to be a good player. And with the new redshirt rule, there's really no harm in him playing even in 4 games. I mean, with his frame, he's definitely going to pack on weight. There's very few guys who have ever played at that 6'7", 215 size at defensive end and had success. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but at the same time, he's such a freakish athlete that you got to figure there could be a way that he could get his feet wet, play, and I'm not saying be, even in the 2 deep, but once in a while get a rotation, maybe against one of the opponents in a very specific way, against a very specific tackle, maybe one of the lighter offensive tackles that they place, and just see what he can do.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's still a better path than having to fight to stave off, the pursuit of everybody else, 5-6 months from now. And sure, there's always a possibility that, he gets 3-4 games of film out there and then wants to transfer for a bigger payday. Like, I don't know the kid, I don't know the family, I don't know anything. So obviously there's always going to be a risk, but that would be a risk regardless. So I think that this ultimately is a great thing. And we'll just see what he can do when he gets on the field. I mean, he's the highest rated commit, or was the highest rated commit in the 2026 class. So, I mean, if you wanted anyone on your team, especially at a position of need, potentially like defensive end, it can't ask for anything more in terms of off-season training camp news.
Yeah, and I think even if he doesn't make an impact at all this year, you get him in for a year before, right? Extra development, strength and conditioning, and get him to a point where he can make a huge impact next season, where he would have been a brand new freshman. So I think it just accelerates his development, whether that's immediate this year on the field or not. It's still a great move to all the points you referenced, and also just in terms of his ceiling, for the following season. Talking about strength and conditioning, obviously Spencer Brown, new strength and conditioning, I guess the director of sports performance, they're calling it, replacing longtime strength and conditioning coach Jay Butler. Some initial signs. I mean, a lot of guys look bigger. You've seen pictures. You're looking at the weights on the roster. Obviously, Collier's kind of a perfect tie into that in terms of what he needs to do. What are your initial impressions or kind of thoughts about what you've heard and seen about Spencer Brown with his impact on the program so far and what he could do for a player like Collier, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. He hasn't been here for that long, so it's hard to say what the long-term results are going to be. The key thing whenever you look at something like this is, well, I guess there's 2 keys. One, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, getting up, doing your lifting. There's some guys who are just weight room fiends who just love it. They love being in there. They, if they weren't playing football, they'd be lifting weights anyway. You have some guys like that. But for the most part, when you're a student and you're in the dog days of training camp or spring, or even when you're at home on your own and you're supposed to be doing your workouts, there's definitely an energy and an invigoration that is required to keep on keeping on again for most of the guys. And so even if your outgoing staff was good, sometimes just that new energy can make a difference, especially for something like weightlifting where you hit these plateaus and you just kind of sometimes need a new idea or new concepts to kind of keep yourself moving forward. So that's always possible. But then because we don't have enough of a large data set, it's too early to tell if this staff is, for example, pulling the Kenny Parker, Chris Ash, where I think they just put too much weight on guys too
Yep.
quickly, and either they lost their speed or they lost their agility or flexibility, which you know, that's a very, very thin line. And it's really hard to do that without being a really, really individualized plan for every single player. I think one of the things that Shiano's staff did really well the first time around with previous coach Jay Butler was I think, especially with the defensive backs, they made sure that they were cut and not carrying too much weight that they would lose their speed. When I look at the times of the guys who played last year and were outgoing from the secondary, a lot of 4.62s, in the 40-yard dash or, average times in 3-cone drill, I'm not sure if that was just what those guys were capped out at or if they really could have been faster or if they could have maintained the same weight and been faster. But clearly, Shiano realized there had to be some change to be made. And as long as it's not at the expense of injuries, because that could also be a factor here, last year this team was just so beat up, especially on defense, that yeah, there's certain things you can do, but if a guy is too cut, I mean, everybody's joking around with Luka Doncic claiming to be in the best shape of his life, and now in basketball, oh, he's gonna strain his pec or something like that because his body's not used to carrying that weight. So there are certain things about if you transform your body too quickly that can potentially have negative consequences. But ultimately, you got to trust Shiano and his other staff that they made a decision that was best for them about a guys who can balance all these factors all at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about the miscues of Ash and Kenny Parker. That was, I think, a huge misstep in the beginning of that era and kind of, did them no favors as they went down the road. But I think I'm more confident in this move that if you look at last year, and we've talked about it at length with the struggles that this team had, it was team speed. They were just
Right.
blown off the ball time and time again. And yes, injuries were part of that, but I think it was clear to everyone in this on that staff that they had to get more speed. They had to, and it's not just about acquiring speed; it's about developing speed in terms of maxing out. And I have to believe that Spencer Brown coming on board is got to be part of that strategy. Whether that pays off or not, we'll see. But it does seem to me that that would be strategic from that standpoint, that they felt that that was an area of need. And obviously, getting more cut, and being more efficient as a player, is important and not just how you look. So we'll see. But I think I have to believe that that's the intent to get more team speed to improve
Yes.
as a whole because that was an area that UCLA game still, you just see them running all over the place. The Illinois, at the end of that game, there's just so many examples of Rutgers getting blown off the ball on the defensive side. So I'm optimistic that this change was for that reason and that it also bears results this year. Let's talk offense. Obviously, lots of reasons to be excited. Just want to playfully first call out that, NJ.com, Brian Fonseca did an article on is this year's roster the best Shiano's had since his second tenure, comparing each position group to last year. One very interesting kind of comparison he made was calling the running backs equal to last year, which is a pretty bold statement by Fonseca. All of a sudden, he's Mr. Optimistic, drinking the Kool-Aid. We lost Kyle Monangai. We know that's a massive loss. Very optimistic on CJ Campbell. I think in terms of, offensive line, you lost Holland Pierce. I think, tell me if you agree, I think the biggest loss for this offense is the blocking of Monangai and Pierce. And I'm just wondering how that's going to impact Cali Manis. I know we're really high in the receivers. I know, the offense really could take a step forward. But to me, that's the one part that's really worrying me about this offense not being able to take a step forward is Cali Kamanis not having nearly the comfort level he had last year based on those two blockers gone alone. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if to me, it's really a question: is this more detrimental to the ceiling or more detrimental to the floor of this offense? Because I was just recently, you shared my contact with the Play the Fight Song podcast, so I made a recent appearance on there. Thanks for setting that one up. And the thing that I was mentioning there was the loss of Holland Pierce. Like, Rutgers has offensive linemen that. Did you lose me there?
No, keep going.
The Rutgers offensive line is kind of maxed out when it comes to 3-star players, right? And so Holland Pierce was kind of a unique example because he's such a physical specimen that kind of came out of nowhere and ultimately was, picked up by the Philadelphia Eagles after a stellar college career. I just feel like the Rutgers offensive line is kind of capped out. They need some of their more physically gifted guys to make gains and to be there to be able to like blow some holes and open up in the run game. In the pass game, I think they can absorb the losses slightly more, but to your point, a quarterback has to have trust in the backs that are there. They're going to be able to pick up anybody who comes through if they're not going out for a route. And yeah, there's a tendency to feel confident that, hey, we're just going to we're going to use CJ Campbell more as a check down option. But if you're doing that, you still need him to sit in there and block. And no matter how good he is at blocking, I know it's not as good as Kyle Monungai was last year. So, I mean, again, we haven't seen the kid in a Rutgers uniform block anybody in a Big Ten game. But, I mean, Kyle Monungai was so reliable in that regard. That's one reason he didn't catch as many passes. And that was one of the reasons Kenny Fletcher could do the kind of damage he did, was because Rutgers was using a back as their kind of sixth blocker a lot of times rather than their tight end. And so, I think that's a huge concern for me. And the other thing when you talk about that is we also had Sam Brown, who was carrying the load heavily against Virginia Tech, and they don't have anyone like that on this roster. Now, Campbell, again, may add a different dimension, but you're kind of, to me, that's kind of offsets in terms of CJ Campbell being a unique skill set, Sam Brown being a unique skill set. And yeah, Antoine Raymond's better. Deshaun Benjamin's conceivably healthy. I think we are really understating the potential loss of Kyle Monungai. And I hope that this offense can be more high flying. They might not miss him as much if they're trying to make a comeback and they're doing a lot of, teams facing a cover two and you're trying to throw the ball a lot. But I mean, he was the heartbeat of this offense for 2 years. And when you rewatch games like that Michigan State game where he's just both Michigan State games where he's just crushing people, that just brought energy that the other team looked defeated. And I don't know if anyone on this team is bringing that right now, because they don't have anybody that's either so physically gifted or so physically like insane like Kyle Monungai, the way he plays, that you can just kind of like exert your will on the other team like they did with those two players. And so that's kind of my concern overall. And yeah, it's possible at the end of the season we say, yeah, the running backs are better. But to me at this point in time, I wouldn't agree with that. And then offensive line, I've shared, my concern is that, yeah, I think, the base of every guy is pretty high, but there's nobody who's like an above average pass blocker and run blocker like Holland Pierce was last year. So a lot of other guys are going to have to show a lot of improvement for us to feel the same way that we did about the offensive line a year ago.
Yeah, all great points. I think to your point about running back, I think there's a lot on Antoine Raymond this year to be, a consistent contributor. Whether I think he does have the potential not to be as good of a blocker as Monungai, but be a serviceable blocker, to be at least play that role and to be able to grind out some yards. I mean, obviously the way he played in that bowl game was very encouraging. But that's a big jump to be able to do that on a consistent basis. Even come close to the way that Monungai was able to do it. And then, yeah, I do think as a staff, strategically adding CJ Campbell when you lose a guy Monungai, I think that shows some vision there, because I think you're saying, all right, we can't replicate a Kyle Monungai, but we're going to get a guy that can maybe compensate for some inefficiencies with the loss of Monungai. So right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm really high on him. And I think DT Sheffield, another kind of quick hitter kind of receiver, I think. you're building your offensive passing game around the fact that you probably won't have as good a blocking. So I think there's some real strategic vision that the staff showed and how they rebuilt the roster. It's just a matter of if this is going to work, and it all comes down to Cali McManus being able to kind of navigate those changes. And we saw that Nebraska game. It's still kind of haunting, and how beat up he got with that bulky knee, and just not being able to kind of get off the ball and get free. And it's going to be really interesting. It's I don't mean this as a cop out, but I really think we could have a boom or bust type season as a whole, which we'll get to. But I think that the offense has a ton of potential. But just looking at last year, I mean, I think we forget how how much this offense produced yardage wise, scoring wise. I mean, they scored over 40 points 4 times. They scored over 30 points another 4 times. I mean, there were very few games with it. I think was it 2 games they scored under 26 all season.
Yeah, and it was the back-to-back weeks. It was the Nebraska and Wisconsin games.
Yeah, and UCLA they scored 20. So
no, they scored 33 against UCLA or USC.
USC. Oh, actually, you know what? And Washington they scored 21. So listen, they had four games where they didn't score a lot. Everything else was in the 30s and 40s, more or less. So I think we forget how good that offense was. I think we all have hopes that the wide receiving core is going to take a step forward. You had Weber to Fletcher, a tight end. But again, I think the offensive line just being able to kind of hold the line, with so many changes, obviously internally and the inside, they're the same. But on the edges there, it could be concerning. I think, obviously Needham, how does he respond? But there's a lot of question marks. I think more than people are maybe being honest about. I just mean the fan base as a whole. And there's certainly a lot of, breakout potential with certain athletes. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. And that, the beginning of that schedule actually makes me nervous, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But they're not playing any cupcakes to start, and I think you're playing 2 physical MAC teams. It's going to test that offensive line right away.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, I think man on man, they're a good offensive line. They're a skilled offensive line, but they don't have anybody who you're like, this guy is an absolute mauler, like they have in some seasons past. And so, to your point, yeah, I think they know they're going to have to pass more. They're more built to absorb that, assuming your left tackle can block and you have a back or a tight end. Again, if your back can't block, then you might just be forced to keep a Colin Weber or one of your other tight ends really as your 6th blocker, in effect, on passing downs, right? And then eventually be a check down. So, yeah, I mean, overall, the other thing to keep in mind that we have to not forget, Cal Monungai was what, 23 years old? Anton Raymond's 18, right? Because he reclassified. And so he was, I think, 17 last year. So you're talking about a guy who's 5, maybe only 4 at least years difference. And just picture Kyle Monungai, even if they're the same exact body type, which they're close, but a 19-year-old Kyle Monungai or an 18-year-old Kyle Monungai is not a 23-year-old Kyle Monungai like we saw last year in terms of like that old man strength to be a blocker, right? Never mind the experience that he had from multiple years. And so again, I think it's one of those things where we'll look back in time and say, yes, there was there was more talent on this team across the board, another year of development, but we got to see it on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't help that, Rutgers is consistently ranked in the top 5 or 6 of hardest schedules in college football. We know the differences. Obviously, you have Ohio State, Penn State to end the year. Not going to be easy at all, which just puts more importance on the beginning of the year, which seems like every season now that they have to start 4-0 to have a good chance to make a bowl game. But this year, for sure, with the way that schedule ends, they have to start strong. And while I think there's the potential to do that, let's talk more about the defense because there's a lot of new faces on defense and a lot of question marks because how are they going to mix it up? There's some defensive staff coaching changes. It's going to be a little bit of a new look defense. Maybe that's a good thing after last year, a big step back after the year before. What are your initial thoughts or I guess kind of points that jump out to you in terms of the personnel with the defense heading into the season?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it. I talked about it with Larry K and Night Watch, and I also talked about it on the Play the Fight song, I should say, podcast. Is this defense is not as skilled as it was a year ago. They don't have as many guys with as much experience, with as much football skills today. But the problem that you highlighted earlier when you just were talking is that team speed really killed them. I mean, that Kansas State, it wasn't that they were running right up the gut, right? Whereas a lot of times when you're giving up a lot of rushing yardage, it's just they're just running up the middle, running. But no, that was not what was happening. It was either triple option where one of the options is middle, or it was more so just getting outside and then not having linebackers, safeties, and corners who were a combination of both fast, strong, and savvy. It's not like smart. It's more just like savvy with a good feel for the game about where they needed to cut those angles off. And so if you're not as smart, but you're a little bit faster, your margin for error is a little bit larger. And when
Mhm.
you look at how this team is going to play, especially if we hear that they're going with 3 cornerbacks and 2 safeties as their base rather than 2 cornerbacks and 3 safeties, that alone you think should help a little bit with the team speed. I think Jabomi will be better now that he's had a full offseason to diagnose it. And then really, I think there's just a lot riding on Jet Elad because they're going to need a safety who can cut those angles down. We talked about this with Brendan White in the 2020 season. They went 3-6, but you had to figure if they would have played 3 in the pandemic season, if they would have played 3, non-Big Ten opponents, they probably would have won 3-0. That team would have been probably about a 6-6 club. But it was because they had him in the back that this heat-seeking missile that he could cut most angles off. That it was a 20-yard run instead of a 50-yard run. It was a 12-yard run instead of or 20, or it was a 5-yard run instead of 10. And so just preventing those big plays because of that speed and those angles might allow them to have an equal level of success, even if they're not as experienced and, you know, like as good at tackling and things like that. But again, I think that's why I think there's a lot of pressure on Elad and Sanders, especially as your 2 safeties. And then really you're hoping that Jabomi, Walker, whoever's playing linebacker is even better because they're going to miss the loss of Tyreen Powell. I mean, Tyreen Powell had great football instincts. For his size to be able to go sideline to sideline at times was pretty impressive. So that's my biggest thing with the defense is a year ago they had everybody back. And now, I mean, before the Toure injury, and now you have all new faces pretty much, except for a couple guys who were pressed into duty kind of last minute. And so I think this is going to play better against those elite teams. I'm not saying they're going to win, but if the other team is as skilled as you and faster, it doesn't end well.
Mhm.
So at least if you've got maybe some slight advantages in those areas, or at least you're fast enough, you might be able to, you know, get by on certain games or certain plays or certain drives that last year they would just give up a 20-yard play, a 20-yard play, and then they couldn't stop anything.
Yeah, obviously limiting big plays. That was a surprise last season with how many they were able to give up. And in some of those losses, UCLA, perfect example, just they were getting shredded in every way. I look at it too in terms of, Sean always, we haven't heard it too much yet, but it's a developmental program and all this. We saw last year it kind of didn't come to fruition at times early enough in the season. At November, we saw some payoff, but it wasn't there in October when they needed it. If you're looking at position groups, obviously there's a lot of transfers added to the defense. But players that have been in the program now for a while that I'm looking at, at the defensive tackle, Zaire Angoy, linebacker Abram Wright. You mentioned Kaj Sanders. Like those are guys that can they make that leap? Can they become legit starters for this team and make a huge impact? The way the guys that just graduated were, 3-year starters that yes, they had some shortcomings. They were a little bit inconsistent, but at the same time, they all made big plays over time. Those are the kind of guys that I think, as much as some of these transfers, you need that development in the program. Guys that have been entering their second, third years to really make an impact this year. And it's a lot of guys that have to step up for this defense to be at a level that is going to make them a good football team. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not saying it won't happen. Obviously, if there's a side of the ball you have confidence in under Schiano, it's the defense. But there's a lot of changes with the staff. There's a lot of changes with personnel. And I do think it's, no matter how good it ends, it's going to take a little bit for them to kind of gel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we said it's basically 9 new starters, right? You have Drabomi back and Kaj Sanders, who was a most time starter. And
Yeah.
then a couple guys who have started games on the defensive line. I'm sure Jordan Thompson's probably started a game. Maybe a couple other guys at D tackle, like late in the year. Kashawn Griffin was in the rotation, playing pretty well. I think defensive tackle is a position where you can get by with guys who can just hold the line. But other places like defensive end is a little tougher, or the guys who are playing outside on the linebackers. I mean, there could be time that they need to gel. But again, this is why you have Rob Smith. What is his specialty? His first year coming to a program, installing the fundamentals of the defense, getting them to understand the basics and to operate the basics at a pretty high level. And so the irony being, everybody was not particularly thrilled with the hire, but if you need a person for just that one thing, that's really what we might be talking about here.
Yeah, it's a great point, and but that one thing has to happen, I think, for this team to move forward. So, okay, were we saying we were going to go to the Mac stuff now? I forget. Was there one other thing? Mac.
Yeah, with that or athletic director.
Oh yeah, Mac, and then okay. And to your point about Rob Smith, mentioned it before. It's going to take some time to gel. However, Rutgers is a pretty, and listen, they're not playing a Power 4 team in September, but they have 2 MAC opponents back to back to open the season. Both are projected second and third in the MAC, Ohio and Miami of Ohio. It's definitely not, an easy start. And we saw, I think last year was the first year in like 16, 17 years that a MAC team didn't beat a Big Ten opponent. It worries me, and I said it last year too, and I say it every year. And it's, an August Thursday night. There's not going to be a lot of fans there probably. It's going into, Labor Day weekend. That team, Rutgers, needs to come out motivated. I think the way that Schiano runs training camp, I think that was something we kind of looked back on last year, and I personally was a little critical of. Obviously, I don't know all the ins and outs, but it just seemed the approach to training camp last year kind of left them pretty beat up entering the season. How do you, obviously, injuries can happen no matter what, but, does Schiano maybe change his approach a little bit? Does he kind of wean off the gas, a week or two, maybe a couple weeks before this season? How does he have these guys coming in, frothing at the mouth, going into a huge season opener against a team that they could easily lose to if they come out flat, don't execute, don't play as a team, make mistakes? Obviously, that can happen any week, but I just think for a week 1 opponent, playing a MAC team is always dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, you know how I felt about this. If I could pick, I would hope they play Penn State the first game every year, because I feel like the first game you want to face a team that may be slightly more talented than you. You surprise them. That first game is always a crapshoot, which is why it does concern me as well. And that's why a lot of times teams opt to schedule, if they can't get a team like a Penn State or something in the first game, they go the other direction and they try to get an FCS team in that first game. So this is kind of like the worst of those. Ohio is a team that is coming off their first conference championship since 1968. So congratulations to the Ohio Bobcats. Their return, their quarterback, and their two of their 3 starting receivers. So, I mean, it's a passing team, but Rutgers knows it. There's going to be a lot of film on them. They do have a new head coach because their head coach got poached for obviously doing such a good job. Their new head coach was their offensive coordinator, though, so it's going to be the same offense, which also is probably a good thing, because Rutgers will have a lot of film on that. It's not like they have a new coach, new offensive scheme, new quarterback all at the same time. Whereas so many teams have, a revolving door of quarterbacks in the transfer portal. This is a quarterback they will have seen in the same offense. So from a film study perspective, I think they're probably in a good spot there. And they need to be ready that this team's going to come out passing. One of the things that we've talked about last year was they weren't ready.
Mm-hmm.
They were resting on their laurels from the year prior when they faced one passing team. And then last year, when teams just decided to just keep letting it fly, no rest, be relentless. I mean, I think they're going to be ready for that this year. So I'm a little more optimistic because of that. I think they're going to know what to expect in this game against Ohio. But again, first game is always a crapshoot, and this is a team that even if they're not projected to win the MAC again like they did a year ago, they are definitely consensus top 3 team in the conference this year.
Yeah, and let me let me be clear. Like, I like also the idea of playing back-to-back MAC teams in terms of preparation for Big Ten play, if you can survive it. If you can't
Right,
get through
right,
it,
right.
then it's going to sink your season. If you get through it and you learn about your team and you get better and you're a little bit tougher for it, I love it. But if you look at the schedule, I mean, Rutgers at worst has to go 4-2 in those first 6 games. You have
Right.
Ohio, Miami of Ohio, Norfolk State, Iowa at home, at Minnesota, at Washington. And you have to be at worst 3-1 going to Minnesota to have a chance at 4-2. Because that back half, you have Oregon, Illinois, Ohio State, Penn State mixed in with Purdue and Maryland. So can this team win 7 games again in the regular season? I think it's possible, but a lot of things have to go right, and you have to win early to be able to get there. We'll get into it, I think, next episode before the season about can they finally win, pull an upset and beat a ranked team. But obviously that's always on the table and kind of a ceiling preventer for this football program for the past, almost 2 decades now. But it's going to be very interesting. I think overall, I do think this team could surprise, and I think their ceiling is certainly a 7-8 win potential. But I do think the floor is definitely lower this year. And, it's a type of thing you don't want to snowball in September with bad luck and with injuries and
Right.
an upset loss, because it's like the weight of that just gets heavier as the season goes on with every other loss, even if they were expected. So that's kind of my initial view. Any kind of closing thoughts on the team here in the second week of training camp?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday about what this is kind of a bizarre season in terms of where I was trying to think of like what seasons to compare this to. And the best ones I could come up with were 2013 and 2008. And in the 2013 season, it was because yes, they had finally won a share of the Big East title for the first time the year before, but they had a golden opportunity where if they would have just won one of their last 2 games, they would have been in a New Year's Six bowl. They would have been outright conference champions. Just like if last year, if they just would have beaten Illinois, they would have been in the Citrus Bowl. You're losing the engine of your team, which in that case was Jawan Jameson. In this case, it was Kyle Monangai. And that 2013 team came out and they lost the season opener at Fresno State in that absolute crazy shootout with Derek Carr and Devontae Adams, who, again, I can't promise you that, the Ohio Bobcats have a Devontae Adams and Derek Carr, but they do return a good quarterback and receivers, right? So you can never say never.
Yeah.
And then that team kind of righted the ship. But if you look at the 2008 team, which ended up starting out 1-5, they ended up making that amazing, second half run when Mike Teal just got hot and the team just couldn't lose. But that was not against a schedule that featured Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State on the back half, right?
Right.
They had a senior quarterback in Mike Teal, very similar to the Calic Manis situation, an experienced guy who's kind of a tall guy, big arm, better athlete than he's given credit for. There's a lot of similarities, but you see the difference between the 2013 team, which kind of started out, they lost that first game, but then they won several in a row, and then they kind of teetered off because their secondary couldn't stop anybody. And then the 2008 team, which started out slow and then came out like gangbusters in the second half. And I just don't think this team has the luxury against a Big Ten schedule to have bumps in the road that are that long, like either of those 2 teams did. So they're going to have to figure it out quick, like you said, because they got to be 4-2 at worst, maybe even 5-1 if they really want to have a shot at a bowl game. Because yeah, you'd like to think Purdue and Maryland are two of the worst teams in the Big Ten that Rutgers does play, but Maryland whooped them 3 years in a row before last year,
Yep.
and Purdue is sandwiched in kind of an odd spot on the schedule, and it's just it's going to be an interesting season to say the least. But to your point, losing one of these first two games for a young team like this, the offense isn't young, but the defense is young, and I
Yeah.
think they're going to need some confidence as well as a training camp that's a little bit more intense, even at the risk of injury, just to really separate, the men from the boys that are on that side of the ball. So kind of to tie 2 points of yours, the training camp, but then also, I think we're going to have to see some of these guys in games to know defensively who's going to be the guys that they roll with as the season progresses.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think because there's a lot of unproven and kind of spots up for grabs, it makes sense to have a more intense training camp. Where last year, I still feel like with all those veterans back, you needed to kind of maybe take a foot off the gas a little bit with all those veterans that you had, knowing what you had. This year, going into it, you don't know what you have, but again, can you press the right buttons going into the season so everyone's aligned and everyone's kind of moving in the right direction right when a kickoff happens, because you're going to need to show up in that first game. Overall, we'll be back to talk about football soon, but I wanted to touch on the hiring of Keli Zinn as athletic director for Rutgers. I thought you and Larry Kay did a great job talking about the athletic director search before it was announced. I had a pretty extensive pod once it was first reported about Keli Zinn coming on. I'm very optimistic about it. I think it was a great hire. Wanted to get your initial thoughts on Keli Zinn as Rutgers athletic director.
Yeah, I mean, the first pitfall that we've talked about so many times with Rutgers and was covered on several podcasts was just don't mess up the opening press conference, which seemed like it went fine. And especially at a position like athletic director, that really does matter. How you present yourself and as an ambassador to the program really does matter. And so, it's not like football as a coach or another sport where, hey, yeah, you might have a bad press conference, but if you go there and win a bunch of games, no one's going to remember that. There's a lot more that you have to do as an athletic director to do that. I think the bigger takeaway though is unless you had a slam dunk hire in that non-traditional way, I think this was probably the right move. And what makes me the most confident in this hire is that you're getting a person who has touched a lot of the different aspects of what being an athletic director is. And you compare that to her predecessor in Pat Hobbs, who was not as versed in a lot of these different elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gives me more confidence that, yeah, she's not going to do everything, but she probably knows a little bit more about every part of the operation to make the right hire or know enough to say, hey, this person it knows their stuff when it comes to facilities or this particular type of fundraising or those types of things. Overall, the biggest pitfall, we talk about it with athletic director as well as sports, is you can't act like this is LSU. Just again, we've ragged on Chris Ash already on this podcast once, but he just thought he was at Ohio State. That's not what this is. And so you got to come up with other creative ways to close the gap and understand that things aren't the exact same. You have to do things in a slightly different way. And with her being places like Maryland, West Virginia, I mean, West Virginia has a strong tradition, but they don't have access to markets like New York or even in the case of LSU, Houston or New Orleans. Like they have nothing like that. And so I think she's probably coming at this from a lot of different angles that are hopefully a positive. And as I mentioned, like you said with Larry Kay, is I was a little concerned that Rutgers would try to get too cute with their hire in terms of like being too like trendy. My other fear was that they weren't going to have a staff in place that was athlete focus centric enough where people can see from the life of an athlete. And I gave the example of gymnastics athletes not feeling supported by the previous regime, and then it like snowballed from there. But I do think that Keli Zinn is bringing a level of professionalism, which is
Mm-hmm.
the most important thing to the job. And then with after that, you see in the press conference, and then she's got her experience in all these different ways. And then the best thing that I liked about the whole thing was that they're here to win because they know that at this day and age, winning doesn't cure all ills, but it does help you preach and share the messaging and develop the young people, and that, hey, you're setting your mind to do this as your goal, and you're going to try to do it the best of your ability. And if you can do that in the sports and you can do that in the classroom, there's a lot of other ways that can kind of pan out. It wasn't just like we're going to win at any cost. It was more, we are using winning as a vehicle to grow young people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very different thing. And so those are just my high level thoughts since the hire. I mean, obviously you covered it extensively, but have you had any other thoughts since your most recent podcast
Yeah,
about
well,
it?
one thing that's ironic is you're replacing Hobbs with an athletic administrator that was in charge of a national championship winning gymnastics program. So that's I
That's
think,
pretty ironic.
yeah, to point that out, so if you're a Rutgers gymnast, right, you went from that situation with Hobbs to now Keli Zinn. I mean, you hit the lottery basically. So I think for them, I'm happy for them. But also I think what's interesting to me is I don't need to repeat certain things, and you made some great points there. She very clearly understands that for Rutgers to really have a chip in the game, they have to generate revenue at a much higher pace than they have. And to
Right.
do that, you need corporate sponsorship. I think she's dead on there. My, I guess, concern or hesitance is how successful can they be in that area, at least initially. And I think that's where it goes to. Keli Zinn is going to be as much of the Rutgers brand and needs to be as much of the Rutgers brand as winning, because it's a little bit of the chicken and egg theory, right? Where
Yeah.
you need that NIL support to win, and you need to win to generate that NIL support. And I think that the X factor and all that is Keli Zinn's experience, is her salesmanship, is her ability to sell Rutgers as a winner in a way before they even are a winner. And I think that is how you break down doors and you bring in new money and you bring in new support, is a leader that you believe in. And I think that's why I'm most optimistic. At the same time, I think she can't put all her eggs in that basket, because that is going to be a really heavy lift initially. I think that first year you have to show progress in some way, tangible progress, not just on the field, but in terms of what you're doing to fundraise, how you're connecting with the fan base. A lot of the fan base felt alienated when Hobbs was here, more so towards the end. So I think generating that, is really important, and it's going to be really interesting. But I think the unique opportunity of, I guess it could go either way, right? She has so many spots to fill. You don't have that institutional knowledge as much, but maybe that's actually a positive in this case. We need a fresh start. I do think you need to bring in some people with local ties that understand the politics, that understand kind of the culture. But at the same time, she has a real chance to go out and cherry pick top talent from other athletic departments and bring them here immediately. And I think if your goal is to generate this corporate sponsorship and really boost revenues, that's what you have to do to be able to do that. It's not the status quo. It's not tapping into your existing staff who haven't been able to do it before. No right or wrong or critical towards that. It's just reality. You need to bring in a player, some other places that can come here. And to your point, you have to do it in a way that works at Rutgers, not just a big time program.
Right.
But I think that is what is a unique opportunity for her to hit that home run that she's trying to hit very early on.
Yeah, I think that's where one of the places the Maryland experience really jumps at me, because they face a lot of the same challenges. They got all kinds of professional sports teams in their area. They've got a very uninspired fan base if they're not winning, especially in football, which is kind of similar to Rutgers if they're not winning. And I think that you never know if someone's going to succeed or not. But if you're looking at the resume and you're looking at, okay, what pieces are on this resume that you think can work, I think there's a lot there. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other thing that I mentioned also when we're talking with Larry K was like, Rutgers was always reactive. And they would always say, well, you hire 5 people with 5 different skills and that are not needed now, but maybe they're needed in the future. And in the past, Rutgers would say, well, we don't want to spend money on that because we might not need them. We might be wasting our resources by doing such a thing. And then they're always inevitably behind because they don't do anything ahead of schedule. there's certain things that they do, like for example, graphic design. Rutgers was way ahead of that, way ahead of it in social media. And I don't think people realize how much that mattered when it came to recruiting and just the perception that you could go and see a tweet about Rutgers landing a player in football with this amazing graphic art on this platform called Twitter that's, wasn't even called X back then. And like that was cool, right? Same thing with football with the red zone, stuff. Like there are certain things that Rutgers does, and you see how impactful they are when they like take a little bit of a risk and do it something differently. And I'm hopeful that she is not going to be handcuffed in feeling like, hey, I can't push my departments to behave in that way. And that's one of the things that I'm optimistic about. Is it seems pretty clear so far that she's not going to take this is how we've done things as an answer.
Totally agree. And I think lastly, it's just kind of funny. It's so Rutgers that the most obvious answer they kind of backed into, where you're bringing the president in specifically, or very much prioritizing the fact that this president, William Tate, comes from LSU, had great success there, understands athletics, understands the value of athletics, has, to your point, the values and wanting to do it the right way, to teach and to develop people through winning. So it's a unique perspective. It's a breath of fresh air, and they bring him in, and yet the plan was still to bring in their own guy to work underneath him, and they ultimately back into him being able to pick his own candidate that he's worked with, has established a rapport with, has a partnership with already. I think that that's a huge win here that, Rutgers did not intentionally try to take advantage of, and yet here we are. So I think that that's a little bit funny in all of this. And I said on my previous pod, I think we could look back on this as ultimately a blessing that that's ended up how it played out. And I think, with Tate and Zinn in charge, there's real reasons to be as optimistic about Rutgers athletics as we've been in a long time. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of change to happen. It's going to take time, but I think that you couldn't have asked for a better 1-2 punch, I think, leading Rutgers athletics going into the 25-26 season after the misery of the last 11 plus months that we've gone through. I think overall we're sitting pretty right now. There's a long road to go, but I'm pretty satisfied with where they're headed.
Yeah, I mean, if you played this scenario out, 1,000 times, how many would you even be in the same ballpark in terms of the hires you would end up with? Again, we don't know how good she's going to do, but Rutgers doesn't have the weight to throw around to just get the best candidate, right? If they did, we wouldn't be in this predicament. And so I think in terms of what you could get with the circumstances that you're in, I don't see it better. And to your point, yeah, it is kind of almost blind luck that they kind of fell into this situation. Sometimes that happens, right? I mean, Gary Nova was going to go to Pitt. Some odd circumstances happen. He ends up back at Rutgers, even though they had another quarterback committed in his class, and he ends up being, the most prolific passer of the Big Ten era. Like sometimes it happens. I mean, we feel like it, the RU screw means it wouldn't, but I mean, the number 2 at an athletic department like LSU is probably the equivalent of what the number 1 at most athletic departments in the country have to do. And so, and when you see how much there's talk about she had to basically be the number 1 in so many areas because the athletic director was on all these committees and everything that were not just specific to the school. I mean, I think this is a unique candidate, and sometimes you shouldn't overthink it. And it seems like President Tate didn't.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt that her mentor is Debbie Yao, the greatest female athletic director of all time. By the way, retweeted 2 of my tweets. So I had a long tangent, a 10 tweet comment thoughts on it. She retweeted that. And then also when she was first hired, she retweeted. But, I mean, talk about a mentor there. So I think, high hopes there. High hopes for Rutgers football. Long way to go. We've had a long episode. David Anderson, thank you so much for being here once again. We'll be together quite a bit this season. We'll have another episode before the season starts. Maybe a game preview. We'll see how that plays out. We have, a lot going on between the two of us. But thanks for listening and watching once again. And we'll talk to you soon here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.